For 20 long years, Silas Kane lived in a silence thicker than any winter snow. His days began before sunrise and ended with the last crackle of dying firewood, and in between stretched the same rhythm of survival: feed the cattle, mend the fences, chop the wood, breathe in the dust. No one wrote, no one called, no one knocked. It wasn't that he'd pushed people away exactly, it was that life had taken them, one by one, and left him with the wind and the soil. He didn't complain. Complaining implied you expected something better. Silas didn't. His ranch, a weathered stretch of land tucked between the distant hills and an old cattle trail, was once alive with laughter. His wife, Ellie, had once hung laundry while humming hymns. She used to call him in for stew, with a voice like spring water, gentle, steady, always warm. But one winter, colder than most, took her away. Pneumonia, the doctor said, a deep, wet cough that no medicine in town could loosen. By the time the thaw came, so had the grave, and Silas stood under the cottonwood tree with her Bible in his hands and no words in his throat. Since that day, the world outside his fences had become something distant, nearly mythical. The small town of Dustwell still existed, 15 miles down a gravel road, but he only went when he had to feed. Salt blocks, the occasional replacement part for the water pump. People would nod when they saw him. No one asked how he was. No one needed to. You could see the answer in his beard, in his boots, in the way he kept his eyes down and his voice low. If pain could be shaped into a man, it would look like Silas Kane. The ranch weathered the seasons with him. The barn sagged with age, its red paint long since surrendered to the sun. The front porch creaked even when no one walked it, and the rocking chair Ellie once loved now sat still, wrapped in cobwebs. Inside, Silas kept things exactly as they had been. Her apron still hung near the stove, her knitting basket untouched by the fireplace. Dust collected like memory on every surface, but he never cleared it away. In some small, stubborn way, it felt like she was still there. He spoke rarely to the animals, mostly a soft command to a stubborn mule, a warning to a nosy rooster. Once or twice, he muttered a curse when his shoulder flared up, but even then, the words came as if from someone else's mouth. He had forgotten what it was to talk for comfort, to say something just because he wanted someone to hear it. He ate his meals in silence, drank his coffee with the clock ticking, and stared out the window at a sky that no longer promised anything. Sometimes, in the deep of night, he would wake in the cold sweat of an old dream, Ellie's voice calling him from across the canyon, her arms outstretched, her hair blowing like river grass in the wind. He always reached for her, and he always woke with his hand on the empty side of the bed. On those nights, he would sit outside until morning, smoking the last of the hand-rolled cigarettes she'd left behind. The silence wasn't comforting, but it was familiar, and familiar was all he had left. Neighbors had stopped asking him to town dances or church long ago. The Kane place was marked on every map, but no one visited anymore. The mail came once a week, but Silas barely read it. Bills, mostly, or occasional notices from the agricultural board. Nothing personal, nothing human. He didn't keep a radio, and he hadn't used the telephone in years. What would he say, and to whom? The world had turned loud and fast, and Silas had no use for either. But in all that silence, a strange peace had settled. Pain once sharp, had worn itself dull against the grind of the years. He no longer cried. He no longer raged. He simply endured. That's what men like him were made for. Not joy, not connection, but the quiet labor of getting through one day so that another could come. And he would have gone on that way, gray, hardened, half-ghost, until the day someone knocked on his gate. It happened on a Wednesday. Silas remembered because Wednesday was when he checked the east pasture and hauled in feed from the storage shed, and because nothing unexpected ever happened on a Wednesday. The wind had kicked up early that morning, carrying the smell of mesquite and a storm far off over the southern ridgeline. He'd just finished filling the trough when he heard it, the unmistakable rattle of chains on the main gate. Not the wind, not a loose latch. A knock, sharp, purposeful. Silas froze. His hand hovered over the last sack of feed. He stared in the direction of the gate, half thinking he'd imagined it. Then it came again, one knock, then two more. Whoever it was wasn't just passing by. They wanted in, and they weren't giving up easy. He hadn't had visitors in months. The last had been a lost hiker, sunburned and stumbling, who asked for water and directions back to town. But even he hadn't dared cross the Kane threshold. Most didn't. Silas was a tall man, broad-shouldered and built like the land, rough, weather-worn, and silent. His reputation did the talking. Folks called him the last ghost of dust, a man you didn't bother, and who didn't bother you. But this knock carried something different, not desperate, not casual, intentional. Silas wiped his hands on his trousers, adjusted his hat, and made the slow walk down the gravel path toward the gate. The dust crunched beneath his boots like brittle bone. As he approached, he saw her, a woman, young, maybe 30 at most, standing alone in the wind. She wasn't from around here. That much was clear. Her coat was torn at the hem, her boots scuffed from miles of walking. She had a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and the kind of look that only came from running. not just from place to place, but from something. Her eyes met his, without fear, but there was a softness there, too, not weakness, something else. A plea. She wasn't ready to speak. You lost? Silas asked, his voice like gravel underfoot. She hesitated. No, she said simply. Her voice was steady, low, but I don't know where else to go. That struck him more than it should have. People didn't come to Silas Kane's ranch unless they had nowhere left to turn. He studied her a moment longer, noting the small details, dirt on her cuffs, cracked lips, the thin layer of weariness hanging on her like dust. This woman had been walking for days, maybe weeks, and whatever she'd left behind, it wasn't finished with her yet. I ain't running a boarding house, Silas said, not cruel, just truthful. I didn't ask for a room, she replied, just shelter a few days. I can work. She gestured to her hands blistered, calloused. I'm not afraid to earn my stay. The wind blew between them, lifting the edge of her coat. Silas looked past her at the road, empty for miles. No car, no wagon, no trail of dust. Wherever she'd come from, she'd come alone, and she meant to stay that way. He could have turned her away. Could have told her there were motels in Dustwell or that strangers didn't last long out here. But something in her voice pulled at a place inside him that hadn't been touched in decades. A quiet echo of the past Ellie's voice, offering kindness without asking permission. You got a name? He asked, finally. She nodded. Mara, he repeated, tasting the word like a memory. Then, without another word, he unlatched the gate and pushed it open. The hinges groaned. Mara stepped through, and for a moment the wind stopped, like even the storm waited to see what would happen next. Silas led her to the porch. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. But he noticed how she glanced around as if learning the shape of this new world. She didn't comment on the dust or the silence. She just walked alongside him like she belonged there. And something deep in his chest stirred, a thing long buried under years of silence and soil. He opened the door, letting her pass. She paused at the threshold, then looked back at him. Thank you, she said. Silas only nodded. He didn't have the words. Not yet, but for the first time in 20 years, someone had stepped inside. And for the first time in 20 years, he didn't want them to leave. The first night passed without much said between them. Silas showed Mara to the spare room, a narrow space that once stored grain sacks but now held an old cot, a kerosene lamp, and a cracked dresser. He didn't apologize for the dust. She didn't seem to mind. She set down her duffel bag, looked around once, and said, "This is fine." Then she closed the door softly behind her. Silas sat by the fire for hours afterward, staring into the embers, trying to make sense of her presence, of what it meant to have a stranger breathing under his roof again. He could still feel the weight of her footsteps in the floorboards, the faint scent of her hair, wild sage and dry rain, drifting in the air. He'd become so used to the quiet that even a single extra breath in the house felt like thunder. In the morning, she was already outside. At first, Silas thought he was dreaming, but there she was, Mara's sleeves rolled up, lifting hay bales with a practiced grip. She didn't ask where things went, she just did what needed doing. When she noticed a sagging fence near the goat shed, she walked over and began removing the broken slats with her bare hands. Silas watched from the porch, coffee in hand, jaw clenched, but not from disapproval, from something else. Al, maybe. Uncertainty. You know how to fix fence? He finally asked. Better than I know how to sit still, she said, brushing hair from her eyes with a dirt-smeared hand. Silas grunted, nodding toward the tool shed. Hammers in there. That day they worked side by side, silently. Mostly, the sun arced high, and the heat pressed down, but Mara never slowed. She didn't ask for breaks. She didn't flinch when a splinter drew blood. She moved like someone who'd been taught the hard way that resting too long got you left behind. Silas recognized it because he lived the same way. Their lives had been carved by the same blade. Different stories, same cut. At lunch, she didn't wait to be invited. She washed her hands with cold water from the pump and sat across from him at the kitchen table. He had made beans and cornbread, not fancy, but enough. She ate like someone who didn't know when the next meal might come. Still, when she saw him pause, she pushed half her cornbread across the table. You didn't take enough, she said. He stared at the piece, then at her. I made it. You're still allowed to eat your fill, she replied. That night, they sat on the porch as the cicadas began their slow chorus. Silas didn't speak much. Old habits die slow. But Mara wasn't a woman who needed constant noise. She seemed to understand that silence wasn't always empty. Sometimes it was full of things you didn't know how to say. After a while, she said, "This place sits quiet, but it doesn't feel dead." He didn't know how to answer. He'd spent so long thinking of the ranch as a graveyard of love, of time, of what he used to be. But hearing her say that, it unsettled something. Made him wonder if maybe it hadn't been dead. Just waiting. Where'd you come from? He asked quietly. She was quiet for a while. Then, somewhere I'm not going back to. He nodded. That was answer enough. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. You live like you've forgotten how to need anything." He didn't reply. Because she wasn't wrong. He hadn't just buried his wife. He'd buried every want, every hunger, every part of himself that asked for warmth. It was easier that way. Needs only hurt when they weren't met. But with her steady hands and unspoken sorrow hadn't come to pry open his pain. She wasn't trying to fix him. She was simply there, sharing the silence, matching his rhythm, like she belonged, and that was the part that scared him the most. Over the next few days, a rhythm emerged between them. It wasn't something they talked about or planned. It just happened. Like water finding its own course. Mara rose with the sun, same as Silas. Sometimes, earlier, she made coffee strong enough to wake the dead and cooked eggs in a cast iron pan like she'd known the stove for years. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait to be told. She just acted confident in a quiet way, not loud or pushy, but like someone who had once survived without kindness and now didn't expect to be stopped if she gave it. Silas watched. This happened like a man afraid to blink. She was never in his way, never loud, never idle. When the barn roof leaked, she was up the ladder before he'd even found his boots. When the water pump sputtered, she was already wrenched deep in rust and sweat, cursing low under her breath. Like a woman raised beside machines, she was raw, capable, but it was her softness that unstrung him most. She whistled to the horses. She knelt when a calf was limping and ran her hand gently along its leg. She stood still for whole minutes in the chicken yard, eyes closed, just listening to the wind. Silas had known women who needed to be saved. Mara wasn't one of them. She didn't need saving, but she did need something, and though she never asked for it in words, he could feel it in the silence between them. One afternoon, while they were mending a broken irrigation line, Mara paused mid-task and said, almost offhand, "Didn't think I'd stay this long." Silas glanced at her, hands soaked from the muddy ditch. "What made you?" She didn't look up from her work. "You didn't ask why I came." He mulled that over. It hadn't been kindness, not really. It was just how he was. Questions were like closed doors. You didn't open one unless you were ready to walk through it. He figured she had enough of her own without him adding to the weight. Mara smiled, not mockingly but like someone, finally, exhaled. "Most men ask questions so they can decide how to judge you. You let me keep my ghosts." Silas didn't reply. He didn't know how, but something in his chest loosened. That night, he poured her an extra cup of coffee and set it on the table without a word. She took it like it meant more than 1,000 thank yous. Their routine became a kind of dance, slow, steady, unspoken. They repaired the north corral. Together, Mara painted the porch while Silas trimmed the dead branches from the oak trees. She even got the old radio working again, tuning it to a crackling station that played half country, half preacher depending on the hour. She laughed when the reception cut out during the punchline of a joke. Silas, to his own surprise, found himself chuckling too. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the world turned golden and still, Mara sat beside him on the porch steps. They shared a flask of something warm and bitter that burned, slow going down. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, but her voice came low and near. "You ever been in love, Silas?" The question hit like a slow bullet. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he handed her the flask and looked out at the fading sky. "Once," he said finally. "Long time ago." She nodded. "Me too. Once." They sat in silence, letting those words settle like dust. Then, after a pause, Mara whispered, "Teach me." It wasn't clear what she meant. Not fully. Not yet. But Silas didn't ask, because he felt it, the way her voice softened, like she was placing something delicate in his hands. Trust, vulnerability. A question she wasn't brave enough to say outright, and in that moment, the air between them shifted. No longer just two strangers surviving the same day, but two broken souls learning the shape of healing, slowly, carefully, together. He didn't touch her that night, not because he didn't want to, Lord, he did, but because something in the way she had whispered, "Teach me," carried the weight of scars he couldn't see. Silas had lived long enough to know that, when someone asked to be taught tenderness, what they were really asking for was to be handled like a human again. Not a body, not a burden, a soul, but something had shifted. Not just in the air, not just in the porch light swaying from its chain. In him, in her, and by the time they stood from the steps and walked back inside, something unspoken tethered them. The next morning, Silas found Mara in the barn, standing beside the foal she had helped deliver a week earlier. The newborn colt nuzzled her hand, and she spoke softly to it, not baby talk, not nonsense, just calm, steady words that sounded like safety. "You talk to animals like they're people," Silas said from the doorway, his arms crossed. She looked up, startled but not afraid. "That's 'cause animals listen better." He smiled. It was the first time his lips had curled that way in years. That afternoon, when the sun reached its highest, Mara sat beside him beneath the big cottonwood tree by the west fence. She brought a tin of peach preserves and 2 forks, and they passed it back and forth like kids hiding something sweet from the world. And for the first time, she reached over and wiped a drip of syrup from his beard. Just a simple gesture, quick, natural, not thinking twice. But her hand lingered for a breath longer than needed, and he didn't flinch. That night, she didn't retreat to the spare room. She stood in the hallway, eyes meeting his, and said, "I don't want to be alone tonight." Silas nodded once, then stepped aside. No words passed between them as she walked into his bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed like someone testing ice before stepping onto a frozen pond. He didn't undress her, didn't reach for her. He sat beside her, their knees barely touching, and whispered, "I don't know how to teach this." She looked up at him, her eyes soft but despairing. "Then show me what it looks like when it's real." And so, for the first time in 2 decades, Silas remembered what tenderness felt like, not in flesh, but in patience. He placed her hand in his, ran his thumb slowly across her knuckles, and breathed deep. There was no urgency in it, no heat, just warmth, just time. And as the wind brushed the curtains and the stars blinked awake beyond the window, he laid beside her like a man who had found something sacred in the wreckage of his life. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She exhaled, as if her body had been holding its breath for years. And only now, in that room, in his arms, did it remember it was allowed to feel safe. They spoke little, but their silence was different now. It wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of ache, of years lost to pain, and of hope, barely formed, like the first green shoot after a fire. When sleep finally took them, it came soft and sure. No nightmares, no ghosts, just rest. And in the dim quiet of early dawn, as the light slowly crept across the wood floor, Silas turned toward her, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, and whispered, "You're safe here." Mara, eyes still closed, smiled. The days after that night unfolded with a softness Silas hadn't known his life was capable of. Something in the world had changed, not the land, not the sky, not even the silence, but how he existed within it. There was less weight to the air, less sting in the solitude. The edges of his days rounded out like weather-worn stone, and Mara, without trying, filled the spaces that had been empty so long he'd forgotten they were there. She didn't press him about his past. She didn't ask what had happened to the woman he never spoke of, the one whose photograph sat in the old drawer beside the bed, and he didn't ask about the man whose name she sometimes whispered in sleep, a name laced with both hurt and apology. They let their ghosts drift between them, quiet as breath, and neither demanded the other bury them. One morning, Mara came in from the fields with a hawk feather caught in her braid. Silas reached out, pulled it loose gently, and held it between his fingers. "You're always walking with your head in the wind," he said. She smiled. "That's the only place I ever hear truth." He nodded, understanding more than he admitted. The wind had always spoken to him too. It was the one voice that never lied. When he'd buried his father, the wind had carried the sound of the shovel like a prayer. When his wife left, it rattled the tin roof all night, like a reminder that the house was too big for one man. And now, it carried Mara's humming from across the yard. And that was the closest thing to a hymn his heart remembered. She spent her mornings tending the horses, her afternoons fixing up the old smokehouse they'd talked about converting into a guest cabin, but her favorite time was dusk. That was when she made them both sit. No chores, no talking, just watching the land, cool and quiet. "It makes the heart still," she said once, as they watched a hawk circle far above, even if just for a few minutes. And Silas realized, with a small ache in his chest, that he hadn't known his heart was ever allowed stillness. One evening, after supper, Mara came into the barn where he was sharpening tools. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, the faint smell of rain on her. "You were a hard man before I came," she said, not accusing, just honest. Silas didn't deny it. He kept his eyes on the blade in his hands. "Still am." Some days she stepped closer, but something's softer now. He looked up at her then, not with surprise, but with the quiet certainty of a man who had been waiting to be seen. "That's not weakness," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's what comes after the fire burns everything down." There was no kiss then. No dramatic embrace. Just the space between them thinning like the air didn't need to keep them apart anymore. Later that night, as the lantern flickered on the windowsill, Mara ran her fingers across a scar on Silas's back. It was long, pale, and crooked, like a memory drawn in bone. "What did this?" he whispered. He didn't turn to look at her. Loneliness. She didn't ask more, just laid her palm over it and let her warmth speak for what words could not. That night, he dreamt not of past battles or endless winters, but of Mara, barefoot in the fields, hair wild with wind, laughing like a woman who believed the world still had beauty in it, and in the dream, he wasn't chasing her. He was standing still, and she was coming toward him, hand outstretched, eyes bright. When he awoke, she was already in the kitchen, boiling water for coffee. The sun was rising. The wind was singing low through the porch rafters, and for the first time in 20 years, Silas felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The peace didn't last forever. It never does. Not out here, where the wind knows every name and the past doesn't stay buried. One morning, just as the sun cracked over the eastern ridge, Silas spotted a dust trail rising in the distance. The kind of line the wind draws behind a fast-moving horse. It came from the same direction Mara had come weeks ago. His gut told him this wasn't a neighbor. By the time the rider came into view, Mara was already outside, eyes fixed on the horizon. Like she'd known this day was coming. She didn't tremble. She didn't speak. But her arms crossed tight over her chest, and her mouth set into a line that spoke of old wounds and hard decisions. The rider slowed near the fence and reined. In a tall black horse, he was lean, sunburned, and wore a crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, there she is," he said, tipping his hat toward Mara. "Didn't think I'd find you all the way out here." Silas stepped onto the porch, shotgun resting across his forearm, not raised, not threatening, just present. Mara took a breath, deep and steady. "What do you want, Caleb?" "Funny way to greet your husband." Silas's eyes flicked toward her. She didn't flinch. "We were never married," she said. "And I'm not going back." Caleb dismounted slowly, like a man too used to being obeyed. "You ran. Took what wasn't yours. My horse, my money. Thought you could disappear." "I took freedom," she said, "and I'm not hiding anymore." Silas spoke then, his voice calm but lined with iron. "She's not alone now. Whatever you were to her before, it ends here." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "You, her savior now." Silas didn't answer. He didn't have to. The air tightened, stretched like rawhide. Then Caleb laughed, short, sharp. "You think I care about some washed-up ranch hand? I've fought worse than you." Silas took one step forward off the porch. "Then you'll recognize what happens next." For a long second, the man seemed to weigh his odds. He looked from Silas to Mara and back again. Whatever he saw in the rancher's eyes, the steadiness, the readiness, made him pause. Finally, Caleb spat in the dirt, muttered something foul, and turned back to his horse. "This ain't over," he said. "It is for you," Silas replied. They watched the dust trail shrink back across the plains. Only when it disappeared into the hills did Mara finally let out the breaths she'd been holding. Her knees gave slightly, and Silas was there in a heartbeat, arms around her before she could fall. "I'm sorry," she whispered into his chest. "I didn't think he'd find me." "You're safe," he said again, and this time, it wasn't a promise. It was a fact. That night, there were no soft words, no porch-light conversations. Just the two of them, sitting close in the dark, the silence heavy with things unspoken. But Silas didn't press her. He just sat with her, shoulders touching, until she reached for his hand. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for today." He squeezed her fingers gently. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," she said, turning to face him. "That's why it means everything." And in that moment, something inside both of them clicked into place. Not lust, not romance, but a deeper kind of knowing. The kind that comes when someone stands between you and the thing you fear most. Not because they're strong, but because they choose to. For the first time, Mara began to believe she wasn't just safe, she was home. Summer faded slowly into fall, and the land softened with the turning season. The fields lost their harsh glare and gave way to golden stalks and cooler winds. It was during these months that the ranch no longer felt like Silas's prison. It felt like their refuge. And every morning, when he rose to the sound of Mara humming in the kitchen, or chopping wood out back, or softly tending to the colts, he felt that something inside him, something dry and cracked and long forgotten, had finally started to grow again. They didn't speak of the day Caleb came and left. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer heavy with secrets, but light with understanding. They lived in a rhythm now, not choreographed, but comfortable, like two people moving around each other, not out of caution, but out of care. Meals were no longer solitary affairs. Mara filled the table with small dishes Silas hadn't tasted in years. Biscuits that flaked apart with honey, beans cooked slow in cast iron, and coffee that always smelled richer when she poured it. Sometimes, in the middle of dinner, she'd laugh at nothing, just the wind outside or the crackle of the stove, and Silas would stop chewing just to listen. To laugh had once felt like betrayal. Now, it felt like proof he hadn't died after all. One afternoon, she found a half-buried box near the barn, an old cedar crate from years ago, stuffed with his wife's letters, some yellowed with time, others torn at the edges from mice or mold. Silas came up behind her as she held one gently, careful not to smudge the ink. "I shouldn't have opened it," she said quietly. "No," he replied. "It's all right." He sat beside her in the dirt, and for the first time in 2 decades, he spoke of Clara, the woman who had once lit up this ranch, who had grown sick one winter and slipped away in silence. Mara didn't offer sympathy. She didn't reach to touch his arm. She just listened, and when he was done, she placed the letters back in the box, closed the lid, and said, "You don't have to let go of her to make room for me." Silas didn't respond. He only nodded, a gesture that, from him, was a promise. As the first frost came, they began preparing for winter together. She patched the roof with him, helped reline the chicken coop, and resealed the well house. And one night, as the fire popped and hissed in the hearth, she turned to him, eyes soft in the glow. "You never answered me," she said. "About what?" "When I asked you to teach me." He looked at her, The way a man looks at water after walking through a desert too long. What is it you want to learn? How to stay, she said. How to trust land, and people, and time. I've only ever known how to run. Silas leaned forward then, resting his weathered hands on hers. It's not a lesson, he said. It's a choice you keep making, even on the days you're scared. Then show me how to keep choosing. He did. Not with grand speeches, or sweeping romance, but in the way he handed her his coat without asking. In the way he'd point out storm clouds miles away so she had time to bring the laundry in. In the way he'd start the kettle 5 minutes before she awoke, just because he knew she'd want tea. Love came quietly. It didn't shout or crash or demand. It settled like dust, like dusk, like something that had always belonged there. And on the first snow, when they sat together on the porch, wrapped in the same blanket, watching the land turn white, Silas reached over, touched her hand, and said, "You've taught me too. What did I teach you?" He stared out at the horizon, where the wind kissed the mountains, how to begin again. And Mara, who had once only known how to survive, smiled at him like a woman finally living.